Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin. You may have been wondering if a linen quilt is for you. And in order to decide that, you need to know what to expect from linen. And guess what? I have a lot to say about that. It's no secret that I love linen. Love linen. And I have worked with linen actually a lot. I was thinking it through. I'm on my 4th linen quilt, just getting ready to start sewing it. I've made 3 linen pillowcases. And so I've been handling linen for a while now, and it turns out that I'm not the only one. I recently had a birthday, and Paul and I went out for dinner, and then we went window shopping. Our path took us by Pottery Barn, and we went into Pottery Barn. Everything else, we just did the windows, but Pottery Barn, got to go in and touch. A solid quarter of the store was bedding, and easily 3/4 of that quarter was linen. Now they had, all the fancy schmancy stuff, Belgian linen and thread count, and it was glorious. Felt so good, so soft. Clearly, I'm not the only one, but not everybody has that same love of linen that I do. It is very different to quilt with than quilting cottons. Very. So this is going to be kind of like a what to expect when you're expecting, except no one is expecting here. Thank God. No one expecting, unless you're expecting a linen quilt, in which case, yes, we're expecting. So knowing what to expect is really the lion's share of enjoying working with linen. And when we were planning this video, we thought about doing this as like a pros and cons, but the reality is that what might be a pro for me might be a con for you, and vice versa. So instead of looking at it like, these are the bad things about linen, these are the good things about linen, let's just talk about the characteristics and qualities of linen. And then when I'm done sharing my experience with the qualities of linen, then I'll give you some techniques toward the end of the video for how to, I started to say manage it, like it's difficult. It's not difficult, but there are some techniques that can make quilting with linen far more successful. So kind of a 2-part thing here, what to expect and then how to do it. But first, I wanted to show you, this is one of the comfort quilts by Sharon Holland. I'm on number 3. I will make this quilt probably 100 more times. I made the joke that I want everyone that I love to have a linen quilt. It might actually happen. The next one I'm making that I have cut the pieces for is for a family member. I've started at my perfect nap quilt, and then I'm just going to be making linen quilts for everyone in the family. And then once I've hit all the family members, then we'll go to friends and so on. The reason why I have this particular one out is it is completed, but has not been washed or dried yet. So you can see it's very smooth. It's just lovely, and it's a simple design, and the fabrics, if you were up close here with me, you do see me feeling it. It's just a fun pattern. It's pretty. This particular quilt has a shirt binding, which is, I think, twill. I'm not going to look at it really close. And then it has this quilting cotton on the back, and it has 80/20 Quilter's Dream batting. And that's going to be important because I'm going to show you as contrast. So when we think about linen, whether it's clothes or quilt, this is kind of what comes to mind. It's just this like lovely, drapey. I'm a little bit obsessed with linen right now. This has not taken into account the singular most important quality about linen, which is it wrinkles. Linen wrinkles. It's like the wind blows and fire burns and rain falls. Linen wrinkles. And I want to show you. So, same quilt, same design, both linen shirt fabrics. This one has been washed and dried and used and washed and dried and used and washed and dried again. So you can see immediately. You know how the Jenny Down from Missouri Star Quilt says if you can't see it from a galloping horse, this you could probably see from a galloping horse. You can just tell immediately this is wrinkled and nubby and lumpy and rumply, all of the umplies. And this is nice and flat. I want to show you by comparison. Okay, so this is 2 folds and this is 2 folds. So you can see just from a glance how much thicker this is than this. That's for a couple of reasons. Once this washes, it's going to puff up more because linen wrinkles. But also this has bamboo batting and a linen backing. I really so struggle with the batting and backing. And then if we put bedding in there, it's awful. So this is getting double wrinkly. So I've got wrinkly on the back, wrinkly on the front, and wonderful soft bamboo in the middle. It's kind of puffier than this one will be because it's that 80-20 and it's got a quilting cotton on the back. But you can see immediately just all of the wrinkles. And the binding, there's the B again, even the binding on this is linen. So everything that could possibly wrinkle on this quilt is and has wrinkled. And then this is prior to washing. So this binding will bunch up a little bit and the cotton will puff up and wrinkle around the quilting a little, but the top that's all linen will do exactly what this quilt has done. And so first thing to consider, this is the what to expect part. If you want your linen quilt to look like this, perhaps linen is not for you. If you don't want wrinkles, you probably don't want a linen quilt, unless you are willing to starch your complete quilt and or press your finished quilt. So if you want to have a linen quilt and it be smooth, you're going to have to be willing to do something to it. It's like when I went from having nice straight brown hair to this silver stuff that has grown out of my scalp as of late. If I want it to be smooth, I better put heat on it or product or both. And linen is just exactly like that. So starch it or press it or both is the only way that you're going to get it to be smooth, because linen is not smooth. It's wrinkly. So for the next few qualities of linen, I'm going to be feeling and talking about my nap quilt. I can't help it. I'm sorry. I am such a tactile person. I really wish there was a touch and feel. You know those touch and feel books that we had for our babies or maybe your grandbabies, and it has the little duckling fuzz, and that's what having this quilt in front of me is just like, because linen is soft. Some of you out there are like, no. New linen off the bolt is not soft. It actually sometimes feels like burlap or canvas. For our purposes, we're going to talk about linen from men's shirts because that's what I have used. That's what my experience is. And it's kind of like the whole point of my channel. Shirts that are made from linen have been worn and washed and worn and washed and worn and washed again. And so they soften, which is the nature of linen. It softens up the more that it is used and worn. But it's not the kind of soft that, like the little duckling in the touch and feel books, it's not fuzzy. It's not smooth. It's not silky or fleecy. It's rough. I don't know any other way to say it. And it's not rough like sandpaper. It's nubby. It's textural. You might even go so far as to say coarse. I don't like to use the word rough because rough feels like an antonym to soft. Like, no, those are not the same. But it really is coarse and textural and kind of nubby because of the natural fibers and the weave of it. Linen, if you didn't know, comes from flax, and it goes through an extensive process to get it to the place where the fibers are usable for fabric. You can actually see all the individual fibers in linen, and that's part of what makes it so interesting. It's visually textural, but it's also physically textural. So you can feel it's fibrous. What would you like to make your next quilt out of? Fiber. As a textile, it's just a very fibrous material. It's a particular type of substrate, but gosh, that just sounds pretentious. One of the things, though, that is so interesting about linen, even though it's kind of has that, I just don't want to say rough, but it is rough, but it softens the more that it's worn and used. And so it just gets this like really delightful, do you see me? I'm doing it. Soft, kind of almost cozy, comfy texture. So it's, I need a thesaurus. It's hard to describe. There's another YouTuber who loves linen and silk, and she was trying to describe how to find linen shirts in the thrift store, and she struggled as much as I have. I mean, it's just hard to describe. It has a nice, luxurious softness to it, and kind of in a similar but not same way, linen relaxes. So it's part of what makes it soft is it relaxes as it's used. And I'm using the word relaxes on purpose. In previous videos, I've said stretches. And by the way, there have been quite a few videos on linen because I love linen. It doesn't really stretch, it relaxes. And so the weave kind of opens up. If you have had any linen garments, you probably attest to this. I am a big fan of linen pants, and I'm also a big fan of sitting cross-legged on the floor working on projects. And when I stand up from having worked on whatever in our living room floor, the knees look like a camel and the backside is stretched out like I have dropped 15 pounds. It stretches out and relaxes into wherever the pressure is. The next quality of linen that I want to talk about is the drape. I really didn't have an appreciation for draping as a positive thing, like what? Until I started quilting. And even with my very first quilt, after it was quilted and before it was washed and dried, I was like, wait, why is it so stiff? Like, why? Why? This is supposed to like flop over the bed and be comforting. So draping as a quality is something that a lot of us who love quilts really love. When a quilt kind of envelops you, and I've heard people call it a quilty hug. It's that, just the drape of the weight of the quilt. It's also one of the things that's kind of frustrating when you first have a brand new quilt that's been highly quilted and maybe doesn't have a very super soft batting. Until it's been used and washed and used some more, it just doesn't have that soft drapey feel. Linen has that in spades, and so it makes it very appealing for the fabric for quilts. And I want to show you that. This is a linen shirt. This is just the back. This is a men's linen shirt. If you can just see this, just even that drape is nice. But when I just lay it down on this quilt, it just drapes beautifully. Even though linen wrinkles and relaxes and stretches in garments, it still often looks very elegant and luxurious, and it's because of the drape. Paul and my youngest daughter and I have been rewatching all of the Great British Baking shows. It's our evening entertainment. We have really enjoyed ourselves. And if you've ever seen that show, sometimes the tent gets very hot and everybody is sweating and miserable looking. And then it pans over to Paul Hollywood. He looks like $1,000,000. Like, why does he look like $1,000,000 in 100-degree heat? And we were watching the other night and I was like, oh, he is wearing a linen shirt. And so he has this blue eyes and he had on this blue linen shirt. And even though it was very evident that it was hot and maybe he had even been sweaty, the hang of the shirt just looked so elegant and expensive and luxurious. And so that's what linen does, even as it's wrinkling and stretching. I mean, you could see the weight of probably the moisture in everyone, but he looked so classy and great. And so that's kind of one of the qualities of linen, that drape, where it just settles beautifully. So what it did in this shirt, just then on this quilt, is what this quilt does when I sit down with it on my couch and lay down to take a nap. It just lays beautifully over me, over the corner of the bed, over the edge of the couch, like wherever I leave it. It's just like it just drapes beautifully. And I go, oh, that's so lovely. So yeah, a lot to say about draping. Next up, we're going to talk about how it breathes. I really won't belabor this point because, first of all, I've talked about it in other videos. Second of all, it's kind of widely known. Something about the natural fibers and the open weave of linen, it really does just breathe well. So it doesn't hold in heat, but then it also does seem to transfer heat and cool well. So it's warm when you need it to be warm, and it's cool when you need it to be cool, and it's because of that way air flows through it. And it dries quickly. Like, I washed this quilt and dried it, and I was thinking, oh gosh, we're going to have to wait on it to come out of the dryer. Didn't really have to wait. It just dries really super quickly. So it makes it a wonderful choice for a quilt that's going to get a lot of use and that's going to need to be washed and dried often, because it's right back in action just almost as soon as you wash it. When I finished my nap quilt, the first thing I noticed was how heavy it was. Like, I picked it up and was like, golly, this is really really heavy. And that is one of the things about linen. It's actually heavier than some of the other fabrics out there, notably cotton, and very much more so than polyester. And to that point, I have my little note because it's details. We recently got a set of linen sheets for my birthday. I thought, I wonder if it's physically heavier, if it's just my imagination because of all of the other things. It's wrinkly and rumply and drapes and all that stuff. Turns out we have a linen pillowcase, a cotton pillowcase, and a polyester pillowcase. So I weighed them, and they're all king-size pillowcases. They're probably not exact, but we're going to say close enough. The polyester pillowcase was 3.8 ounces. So for those of you in the rest of the world that observes the metric system, smart folks, that is 10.7 grams. And that's meaningless until I say the cotton pillowcase was 6.2 ounces. That's 17.6 grams. It's nearly double. And then the linen pillowcase, 7.8 ounces. That's 22.1 grams. So actually physically heavier than cotton. Now, there are different kinds of linen. There are different weights of linen, and there are different weights of cotton. So I realize that is not totally scientific. It wasn't my imagination. If I weighed my two quilts that are close to the same size, the linen quilt is going to be heavier because it actually is heavier, which is such an unusual trait because it has more breathability. So you want to say it's lighter, but it's actually physically heavier, but breathes better. And so for people who like that, the weight, do you see me doing this? You can tell I'm one of these people. For people that would be me. The weight of the quilt, if you like that heaviness on you, like a weighted blanket, you will probably really enjoy a linen quilt. Some people that's too heavy for them and they feel like they're being smothered. So it's a consideration. It's just one of those things, what to expect, especially if you do a linen backing. So if you have a linen quilt top and a linen backing, it's going to be significantly heavier than the exact same quilt in cotton. So keep that in mind. So this is the last of the expectations, at least for this video. Linen ravels. It frays just badly. Can you see that? These strings are just, I mean, you can see I'm putting almost no pressure, and that's just pulling straight away. Going into working with linen in your quilts, you need to have this understanding of linen, just core quality is it ravels and frays. And so that actually is the perfect segue to our next part, which is let's talk about some how-tos and techniques to make your linen quilt a success. So I've talked excessively on my channel about starching, and I wanted to show you what I mean, because when I'm saying starching, I'm meaning one thing, and you may be thinking something totally different. This is the same linen shirt. I dyed it orange. You might notice it behind me in that yellow and orange block. And so it's a little, I don't know, uneven in the dyeing. This one has been starched. This one has not been starched. And I want to show you the difference in what I mean by starch. I'm holding this shirt up. I don't know if you can see how stiff. It's so stiff that I can hold it in just two places and it's like holding the line, right? So let me show you that same thing in the unstarched one. So even if I try to stretch my fingers out to make it be flat, do you see that? When I say I starch my linen, I'm talking heavily, heavily starch. So not like a best press situation, or there's a acorn spray starch that a friend sent me. It's just like a light stiffening spray or sizing. And I want to show you really quick. Now, I've talked a lot about some of these how-tos in other videos, so I'm just going to hit the highlights, but I want you to see what I mean when I say I starch. So I make my own spray starch out of cornstarch and water, and I make it kind of gluey, like pretty thick, almost gelatinous, one would say. And so when I say I heavily starch, I'm going to show you what I mean. So it's like I'm covering the whole entire thing. One might say dousing. I am not baptizing by submersion, but I'm definitely covering all, like I don't want any piece of this fabric to look like it has missed out on the starch train. And if I were to pour this starch out into a container where you could see it, you would be like, ooh, that is so gloopy. Is that a word? Gloopy? Augustus gloop? So I get it all the way drenched, just totally doused. And then I spread it out just like this. And I'm try to be mindful of the grain. I'm not overly mindful, maybe just a little bit mindful. And so I spread it all the way out like this. And then I let it dry overnight. And that is what I mean by starching my fabric. Now, why do I do this? Because it is not hard to work with linen from the sewing standpoint, especially if you've worked with really soft cottons or silky fabric before, because it's kind of slippery. It just won't really hold the line because it drapes so well. But cutting is a nightmare if you have not starched it, and especially if you're using shirts. So if you're looking for a way to get nice, clean, straight lines, precise, heavy starching is the way to go. It doesn't really make this sewing enjoyable. Like sewing with this is not a lot of fun, but it's worth it because of what it saves you in time in cutting. So I want to show you a way to find the grain line for your linen, which makes things a little bit easier in cutting. You want to do this before you start your fabric. So what really you do is you find, you get a nice piece of fabric laid out, and you can take a pin. Sometimes you can do it with your fingernail, but I'm going to go with a pin. All right, so I accidentally pulled two, but you can see the point. So what I'm going to do is, here's my little thread, and I'm just going to tug one, and what it will do, it's kind of making this little pucker. Do you see that? I actually had one started over here as well. And so you can kind of pull the fabric along that line. So there's that one missing thread, my fiber, missing fiber. And it will help you know where to cut on your fabric. Sometimes it's helpful if you're going to use like square pieces or rectangular pieces, and it'll give you a nice straight cut so that you know that as it draws up in the wash or as it relaxes as you use it, it will kind of shrink and expand on the right lines, as opposed to if we cut this kind of crooked, if it draws up, it's going to mess up the piecing. So as you're choosing your quilt patterns, this is just an aside, probably want to stay away from really small pieces or ones that are going to be difficult if they're on the bias. So half square triangles and flying geese are not super great for linen, but squares and rectangles are perfect. Another great tip is, if you're going to sew with linen or if you're going to quilt with linen, reduce your stitch length on your sewing machine. I often hover between 2 to 2.5. If I'm doing a linen something, 1.5, and I've actually even done smaller. So look at the weave of your linen and the grain, and if you can see open spaces, if it's a very open weave, you want to make your stitch length very small. That way it will prevent that raveling. While I'm talking about cutting on the grain, here's a piece of linen that has been cut. This is on the grain, not so much here. And this is to demonstrate the raveling. And this linen is actually white linen threads in one direction and brown linen threads in another direction. And you can see how as those fibers get separated, the raveling can just happen so easily. Now, this is almost a rectangle. Here is some linen cut on the bias. So here's what would be like a half square triangle. And I have taken the time to pick a few of these threads away right there. Do you see that? And just with those two additional threads, look how much of that corner has gotten lost. Do you see that? So on this side, that's one little thread. Here's the second one. And before long, we would be right in that seam allowance. So just with 3 threads, I have lost half of my seam allowance. So when you do, you can imagine that if you had a very big stitch length and this was in the corner, as the quilt gets used and it pulls against those seams, that's what can happen. So the tighter your stitches are to each other, the more it will lock that in. So if you do have that situation where you have linen on the bias, or even if you don't, it won't ravel into your seam allowance, and it'll give it some extra support and kind of security to not have those seams come apart. So for my last, it's not really even a demonstration. It's more to the point of the wrinkly, crumply, rumply, nubby. Someone asked, if you did tighter quilting, will the quilt look less of that wrinkly look? The answer is yes and no. I wanted to give you an example. This is my mid-century modern throw pillow that I finished, and I did do the vermilion trim for those of you that were around for that video. And you can see I did this concentric circles that are roughly an inch in diameter from each other. So this is what it looks like on my couch most of the time. It has been washed and dried. It is a little flatter than the really wide open quilting that I've done on my nap quilt, but it definitely is still wrinkly. It is not smooth. So yes, tighter quilting, it holds that gap, but what happens is it kind of crinkles up in between and around the quilting, just like it would in any other kind of quilting. It's significantly more wrinkly than it would have been if I had made this exact same design in cotton. So I hope this has been helpful for you, just in consideration of whether a linen quilt is for you or for someone you love. And hopefully you'll be prepared and ready to have success with your future linen quilt. I'm Kathy Martin. This is the Catbird Quilts. Thank you so much for watching.